Hi, my name is Maria McKenzie, and I want to thank you for joining me today for a reading from my novel, The Governor's Sons. The Governor's Sons is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble as an ebook. Now, I want to take just a moment to set the scene that I'll be reading from. The time is 1936 in an unnamed southern state. My main character is Ash Croth. Ash is 23 years old. He's worked as a school teacher, and it's the summertime right now. And instead of going back to teaching in the fall, Ash will be going to law school. Ash lives in his family home, which is a sprawling mansion, and for this particular summer, he is working part-time in his father's law office. Catherine Wilkes is 19, and she is African American. Now, back in those days, African American was referred to as Negro, so don't expect any politically correct terms in my book because it is historically accurate. Now, Catherine is working as a maid in Ash's home, and so is her sister Betty Jean. They have an aunt, a great aunt named Isola, and she has worked as a live-in cook for Ash's family for 25 years. And Aunt Isola told her great nieces Betty Jean and Catherine that they could earn good money working for Miss Joan, who is Ash's mother. So that is how Catherine has come to work in Ash's home. Now, at the scene that I will be reading from, Ash has fallen in love with Kitty. She's worked in his home for several weeks. And on a walk home on a Friday evening, he tells her that he is in love with her. Now, upon hearing this, Kitty thinks that he's toying with her, but he convinces her that he really does love her. Now, Kitty, since the first day she's met Ash, has been flirting with him. And, when he first saw her, he was attracted to her. So she has been trying not to fall in love with him because there's just no future. He's from a wealthy family. He's white. It's 1936. She's a black girl, so there's no future there. But Ash convinces her that he really does love her, and she admits that in her heart she has fallen in love with him as well. But this is very confusing for her, and she really can't handle it. But after a passionate kiss on this Friday evening that he has walked her home after she has worked at a party for his mother, he kisses her, and she runs off. Now, I will be reading a scene that takes place the following Monday. Ash only saw her briefly that morning. Now he's come home after working in his father's law office, and he is convinced that he will find Kitty, and he will talk to her alone, and he will convince her that he is willing to do whatever it takes to be with her because he is so in love with her. But as we will see from the scene that I will be reading from chapter 4, that unavoidable circumstances prevent him from getting a chance to talk to her. Ash opened the back door of the mansion, his beige seersucker jacket slung over his shoulder. Once inside, he threw the garment over a chair at the kitchen table. Striding toward the icebox, Ash loosened his tie and opened his collar. He took out a fresh pitcher of ice water and poured himself a glass. Today he left the office early because his father had a confidential meeting with a client at 4:15. But prior to that, most of Ash's day had been spent in the courtroom observing his father defend a different client accused of embezzlement. After finishing one glass of water, Ash poured himself another and set it on the counter. He looked at his wristwatch. It was just past 4:30. Dinner smelled good, cooked and ready on the stove. Ash rolled up his sleeves, then peeked in the large pots to see what Isola had fixed. Looked like chicken and dumplings, collard greens, and yellow squash. Isola usually took a little afternoon break from 4:30 to 5, so she was nowhere in sight. Oddly enough, neither were Kitty or Betty Jean. All day long, Ash hadn't been able to concentrate on much of anything. Thinking about Kitty distracted him. After failing to talk to her this morning, he'd hoped to now. Most days around this time, she and Betty Jean were in the kitchen. He'd find her. She couldn't be far away. Ash raked a hand through his hair, then propped himself against the counter. He picked up his glass and held the ice water to his temple, trying to relieve the heat. For a moment, he closed his eyes, hearing only the buzz of the ceiling fan and the tinkle of ice cubes as he moved his glass. Ash had been up since before 6, and now as he thought about Kitty again, he almost drifted off. But a knock at the back door jolted him awake. Ash strode across the kitchen, still holding his water. When he opened the back door, he saw a well-dressed Negro standing there. "Good afternoon, sir," the Negro said in a low, deep voice. Ash knew he'd never met this young man, yet there was something vaguely familiar about him. He wore a black suit on his tall, slim frame, and appeared rather bookish with a bow tie and horn-rimmed glasses. His black hair was shortly cropped, and his skin a deep reddish brown. From the Negro's grim expression, Ash pegged him as somebody that didn't smile all that much. "Afternoon," Ash said. "Can I help you?" It finally dawned on him why the boy looked so familiar. Ash had just read an article in National Geographic about a display of mummified Egyptian pharaohs. There were lots of photographs, and this fellow looked just like one of those mummies. Ramses the something. Ash couldn't remember the exact number. "I'm here to see Miss Catherine Wilkes. May I ask who's calling?" "Russell Graham, sir." Russell was a little taller than Ash, so Ash stood as tall as he could, trying to stretch his 5'11" and 3/4" frame to that even 6 feet he claimed to be. Not taking his eyes from the serious-looking Negroes, he drank a long gulp of water, then scowled, "You got the wrong house." Before Russell could say anything else, Ash felt someone grasp his shoulder from behind and push him aside. It was Kitty. "Mr. Ash, I'm right here, and stop being such a prankster." She smiled. "Mr. Ashcroft, this is Russell Graham, Jr., and I was expecting him." "Nice to meet you," Russell said, but he didn't look at Ash, only Kitty. Too taken aback by how glamorous Kitty looked, Ash didn't say anything back to Russell. Her hair, no longer a kinky mass, was smooth, set in soft curls that framed her face, and she wore makeup that only enhanced her natural beauty. Satin pumps matched the off-the-shoulder apricot dress, and its shiny fabric shimmered against Kitty's cocoa-brown skin. The straight cut accentuated her curves, and a tantalizing side slit revealed just enough leg. But when Ash saw Russell's eyes assess every inch of Kitty's body, his blood nearly hit the boiling point. "You look absolutely stunning, Catherine," Russell said. "Thank you, Russell." She grabbed his hand. "Come in. Miss Jones said that would be fine." "Catherine," Miss Jones called as she walked through the swinging door. "I thought I heard someone knocking. Is this your young man?" she asked, rapidly waving the newspaper fan she'd received at yesterday's church service. "Yes, ma'am," Kitty said. "Mrs. Croft, this is Russell Graham, Jr. Russell, Mrs. Croft." "Why, Russell Graham, Jr." Miss Jones smiled broadly, extending her hand. "I'm pleased to meet you." Ash noticed his mother acting a bit more animated than usual. She'd probably had a dose of Lydia Pinkham. Mother and all her middle-aged friends going through the change of life raved about that blasted medicine. It had the same effect as 2 or 3 glasses of wine. "I'm familiar with your father's work," Miss Jones continued. "It was Russell Graham Sr. that handled the body of one of my most faithful servants, Effie Watson, about 5 years ago. I attended the visitation at her sister's home, and Effie was absolutely beautiful and so natural-looking." "I'm glad her appearance left a memorable impression, ma'am," Russell said in a smooth baritone voice. "Oh, indeed it did. And Catherine tells me that after you graduate next year, you'll be going to mortuary school so you can eventually take over the family business." Behind Russell's back, Ash looked at Kitty strangely. With exaggerated disbelief, he mouthed the words, "Mortuary school?" Kitty bit her lower lip, then looked down and began playing with her fingers. "Yes, Mrs. Croft," Russell replied. "Well, it's a fine business, and unfortunately quite profitable. People never stop dying, do they?" she smiled. "Yes, ma'am, but we must accept that death ultimately is a part of life." Miss Jones laughed a little. "Death a part of life," she mused. "I guess I never thought about it quite like that. Well, I just wanted to say hello and compliment your family's work." "Thank you, ma'am." Miss Jones fanned in broad strokes across her face and chest. "I won't take up any more of your time. I'll leave you alone so you and Catherine can socialize while you wait for your other guests to arrive. It was nice to meet you, Russell." "Thank you, Mrs. Croft." "Ash," Miss Jones said as she strode toward the swinging door, "why don't you come with me and tell me about your father's case in court today?" "I will, in a minute." So this was Russell, Ash said to himself, a mummified mortician. Kitty couldn't marry him. Russell looked like he couldn't crack a smile, and he seemed half dead. If she did marry him, vivacious as she was, Russell would suck the life right out of her, just like Bela Lugosi in one of those vampire movies. That mortician could never love Kitty like he could, Ash thought. Russell didn't have enough life in him, but Ash could make her happy, despite the sacrifices she'd have to make to be with him. Ash toyed with the idea of legally marrying her up north. However, with ambitions of being governor, could he have Kitty too? If Ash did marry her, how could he keep that a secret? Would she be satisfied with only his word and his honor as a gentleman that he'd always love her and never leave her? Love makes a way, Ash decided, so he wouldn't give up. Ash, Miss Joan called from her parlor. I'm coming. I'm just gonna finish my water. Ash drained his glass, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he stood glaring at Kitty. She sat at the side of the kitchen table while Russell sat next to her at the end. The two were engaged in a pleasant conversation. Miss Joan let me make us some iced tea. Will you have some? Kitty asked Russell. Oh, yes, please, he replied. As Kitty turned toward the icebox, she found Ash propped against the counter next to it. She hesitated, caught off guard by the way he looked at her. His eyes said she was his, and he felt betrayed seeing her with another man. And the truth was, she wanted to be his. She loved Ash, but she wasn't a fool. What kind of future would she have with him? At least with Russell, she knew stability and security were guaranteed. And she was sure she'd grow to love him. She liked Russell and enjoyed his company. But Ash moved her in a way she'd never been moved. Although she'd never been with a man, she wanted Ash in that way. Shocked by these unladylike thoughts, Kitty took her eyes from Ash's and quickly walked to the icebox. She pulled out the tea and took it to the table. Avoiding Ash's eyes, Kitty again turned in his direction to retrieve 2 glasses from the cabinet next to him. Once seated, she poured iced tea for Russell, and then for herself. Ash still stood behind her. She could almost feel his eyes boring into her back. Oh, she wished he'd leave. But to her dismay, he boldly yanked out the chair next to hers and sat down. I suppose y'all don't mind if I join you for a little while. His tone implied they had no choice. Ash sat closer to Kitty than necessary. His thigh touched hers and she pulled away. Feeling awkward, Kitty said, It's your house. I didn't know you were leaving work early today, Ash said to her. Your mama's letting us, even though she needed us to stay until 3:30. She suggested we bring our nice clothes with us so our dates could pick us up here. Now, sir, do you, care for tea? No, thanks. So where are y'all going? There's a young people's dinner at the church tonight, Kitty said. And afterwards, Russell added, there's going to be a speaker. Sounds like a big evening for you and Russell, Ash said. So Betty Jean's going too? Yes, Mr. Ash. Kitty took a sip of tea, and her beau should be here any minute. They heard someone stumble in the small hall off the kitchen near Isola's room. Betty Jean must be ready. Kitty stood up, relieved to escape. I told her not to wear those thick glasses, so I better go help her before she falls and kills herself. Kitty almost tripped as she fled from the kitchen. She found her sister feeling her way down the hall. Wait a minute, Betty Jean. You could have called for help, you know. I can find my way. No, you can't, Kitty snapped. You're blind as a bat. No use cracking your head before we leave. Is something wrong? Betty Jean whispered as they walked into the kitchen. Kitty ignored her, then said, Why, Betty Jean, just look who's out here, Russell and Mr. Ash. Oh, Betty Jean said quietly. Upon seeing the ladies, both men stood. Afternoon, Miss Betty Jean, Russell said. You look absolutely divine in that key lime silk chiffon. Since Russell assisted in the mortuary during the summers, he'd become familiar with the different fabrics and colors used in women's fashion while preparing female corpses. Why, thank you, Russell, Betty Jean smiled. I'll set you right here by Mr. Ash. Kitty helped her sister to the seat she'd vacated moments earlier. And Russell's on your other side. Seeking refuge, Kitty walked to the chair at the opposite end of the table, pulling it about 2 feet away so she wouldn't be too close to Ash. You do look mighty pretty, Ash said to Betty Jean. After she'd thanked him, he glanced over at Kitty, then turned back to Betty Jean. So, Kitty says your beau is going to this church affair too. Yes, sir. I didn't know you were talking to someone. Is he from around here? No, I met him at Wittenberg University, but he's Russell's cousin from Oklahoma. He drove up a few days ago to visit, and he's staying with Russell's family. Where is he now? Ash asked. He wanted to visit some kinfolk south of here, and this was the only day he could, Russell said. He'll pick us up on his way back, then drive us to church. He's got his own